Steve Parker Audiobooks presents Cyber Trail, written and read by Steve Parker.
It's very simple. We know you're suffering. We know your implants have been degrading for the last 40 years. We'll pay all your medical expenses, replace all your first-gen tech. New legs, eyes, nervous system regeneration, everything. All you have to do is tell us everything you know about the stolen sword. Now that's not too much to ask, is it? You have 24 hours. We look forward to hearing from you.
The old man disconnected his periscreen from the local circuit on his third try, cursing his shoddy implants and his old bones for the 100th time that day. 40 years ago, he'd been a young buck, cock-strong and brain-numb, and he'd been amongst the first to sign up with a group of his friends to fight the bastards from over there, to stop them coming over here and taking all our... something. He was thankful to have forgotten most of the propaganda used, but he hadn't forgotten the feeling of going into the recruitment center with his mates and putting his thumbprint on the contracts. Honor, glory, fabulous technology. All this was promised, and to be fair, he'd certainly gotten some of it. 1 out of 3, at least. Better than none, he supposed. They had carved up the young volunteers like lab rats and thrown away the excess meat to be replaced with shining chrome. New legs to run tirelessly as fast as a car. New eyes to see in any condition and shoot the legs off a spider from a kilometer away. A new nervous system capable of reacting with superhuman speed to stimuli the human brain had not even perceived. It was amazing. They had felt like gods. But even gods were not forever. Most of his pals fell in the first year. It turned out that their army was not the only one with enhanced super soldiers, and the years of war which followed were amongst the worst humanity had ever seen. Who had time to think about civilian casualties when every soldier on the field could withstand a tank shell with barely a scratch to show for it, and charge on to inflict horrible losses on the enemy? No. Full power, at the first hint of action, was the style of the time. Before the first hint, sometimes. Why, the old man himself had once... But this was no time to think of such things. He had been the only survivor from his group of friends, and he was glad to have gotten out alive, whatever he had to do to achieve that. As soon as the war was over, of course, the only thing the powers that be had wanted, almost as much as to recoup their financial expenditure, was data. They brought in the survivors and debriefed them for weeks, and every day they retrieved a piece of their precious technology. They needed to know how it had performed, they said. They also said that the military cybertech was not suitable for civilian life. They would replace them with implants good enough for normal use, good enough to reward the sterling service offered by the young soldiers. Good enough. True, the replacements were good enough, if only barely. His state-of-the-art eyes had been replaced with cameras little better than most people had on their phones. His legs, which could previously outrun a sports car, would now have trouble against the worst player on a small country town football team. Worse than these, though, was his nervous system. The super-reactive, high-speed cyberware could not adequately be removed and replaced, so they had simply throttled the technology, limiting the speed to normal human levels. In a way, that was worse. To know that the super speed was still there, but that he was not allowed to touch it. He'd heard that some ex-soldiers had had the limiters hacked to try and get the speed back, but most had resulted in horrific deaths. The tech was designed to work in concert with the super-powered eyes and the legs of the original system, and the cheaper replacements just could not keep up. He'd heard of one veteran who had literally torn her own body in half when the system had tried to get her out of the way of an oncoming car, but the cheap replacement legs could not keep up with the cyber-enhanced reflexes. The tale might not have been true, but it had scared him enough to not try anything like that himself. He could have borne all these issues, though, if the tech had held up. Gradually, though, things had started to wear down, and the company which had signed contracts promising to continue maintenance of the tech had been sold and resold so many times that the lawyers were happily spending years in court passing the buck without a single soldier ever receiving a single cent of support or compensation. So things just got worse. It was his legs which he noticed first. The connections to his hips were not as perfectly formed as the original pair, resulting in a low-grade pain which never ended. The knees started to squeak and loosen over time. His eyes, too, glitched out sometimes, throwing static over his vision, and once even cutting out completely for a terrifying afternoon until a young man named Pixel had helped to repair them. Pixel was a good boy, and he and his friend Sakura had looked after the old man when the pain was too much for him to bear. He couldn't work, couldn't make enough money to live, but the pair of youngsters made sure he had somewhere to sleep and food to eat every day. Pixel did his best to maintain the old man's tech, but he was a street kid and a gang member with limited resources and problems of his own. The old man, in turn, did his best to help out around the abandoned warehouse which they shared with the other members of the youngsters' gang. He tried to keep the mess to a minimum, cooked a little when he could, but mostly what he could offer was experience. He had learned a lot about tactics in his younger years, and his insight gave the youngsters an edge when it came to defending their turf against the other local gangs. Recently, the boys had accepted a job from a representative of a large corporation. The old man had, of course, advised against it, but the pay offered was more than the entire gang would earn in a year, so they took the job anyway. It went smoothly, surprisingly, and the team came back with a data shard hidden in the hilt of an old sword, which they handed off the next day. No mess, no fuss, or so it seemed. Soon, though, the dogs of other corporations came sniffing around. The youngsters' incursion had not gone unnoticed, and the data stolen was very desirable in certain circles. The gang held firm, however. A job was a job, and any gang which turned on their customers would soon find themselves without income. Eventually, though, the rival corporations had found out about the old man. He was not a member of the gang, but was living with it. Close enough to get at the tech used to steal the data, maybe even close enough to get a copy out. Even better, the old man had an exploitable weakness. He was old, he was broke, he was broken, and in pain. Temptation murmured in the old man's ears.
You have 24 hours. We look forward to hearing from you.